Welcome to Darkverse. I'm Isaac Nightshade. Tonight's story is The Face in the Mirror. When you look into a mirror, something looks back. When Clara inherits a lonely cottage, she thinks she's alone. She isn't. A reflection waits, a life unravels, and the truth is far closer than she ever feared. The face in the mirror. You're not just watching, you're already reflected. Chapter 1. Reflections. The cottage stood isolated, withdrawn from the winding, gravel-covered path, as if it had consciously pulled itself back into the woods, quietly observing the outside world from behind a curtain of tangled branches. It was old, undeniably so, and the signs of neglect were as numerous as they were unmistakable. Ivy crawled voraciously up its stone walls, obscuring the windows like cataracts in cloudy eyes. The roof tiles were darkened by years of rain, speckled with moss, some missing entirely. To Clara, stepping hesitantly from the car onto the moist, leaf-strewn ground, the place radiated a quiet discomfort, a sense of wary expectation. It was hers now, this brittle, forgotten structure, an inheritance passed to her unexpectedly and unwantedly from her late Aunt Margaret. A woman she'd met once or twice as a child, someone who remained mostly as a faded photograph in the recesses of Clara's mind. Yet, here she was, compelled by family obligation or perhaps an obscure need for distance, unpacking the traces of her own life into these foreign, uncertain spaces. Inside, the air was thick, musty, saturated with silence. Every creak of the ancient wood beneath Clara's feet seemed amplified, echoing gently through hollow corridors and empty rooms. The hallway stretched in front of her, dimly lit, its shadowed edges heavy with cobwebs. Clara's fingers brushed over the roughened plaster of the walls, absorbing their texture, their secrets, their memories. Her footsteps were muffled yet heavy, each step reluctant and measured, as if the cottage itself disapproved of her presence. In the hallway, resting imposingly against one wall, was an antique mirror. Its ornate wooden frame was intricately carved with vines and blossoms that twisted gracefully into a pattern far too elegant for this neglected cottage. Yet the glass itself was tarnished, a once bright surface dulled by time, darkened with layers of dust that blurred her reflection, distorting it slightly. Clara approached slowly, her own shape becoming clearer as she drew nearer. For a moment she paused, studying herself. Her features felt distant, a mask she wore rather than her own flesh and bone, something unfamiliar yet known. She leaned closer, her breath briefly fogging the surface. A brief ripple, a slight lag, barely perceptible, but enough to make her step back, her heart quickening slightly. Clara frowned, uncertain. Her own face stared back from within the mottled glass, eyes cautious, lips pressed thin. But it was not entirely her reflection, or at least it didn't feel like her. She moved slightly, testing, tilted her head, lifted her hand, but each action felt wrong somehow, delayed by a fraction of a heartbeat. Clara blinked and her reflection followed, reluctantly, almost defiantly. She turned abruptly away, unsettled, her throat dry. "Just tired," she whispered, a hollow reassurance that dissipated quickly into the empty silence around her. There were boxes to unpack, furniture to rearrange, memories to establish, practical tasks to ground her, anchor her back into reality. She busied herself, deliberately ignoring the presence of the mirror, though she felt its pull like an unseen gravity, always lingering in the periphery of her vision, quietly observing. Evening fell early and sudden. Shadows stretched across the rooms, swallowing corners and crevices until the cottage itself felt smaller, tighter, as though the walls had silently inched inward. Clara unpacked mechanically, placing her belongings around the rooms with minimal thought or purpose. The Cottage seemed indifferent to her attempt to fill its emptiness, rejecting her modest possessions, leaving them looking out of place, inadequate, as if the space itself resented her attempt at familiarity. As night pressed itself fully against the windows, the air grew colder, denser. Clara moved through rooms more quickly now, a nervous energy humming through her bones, her movements restless, unsettled. The cottage was noisier at night, or perhaps simply more alive. The subtle settling of wood, the creaking of hidden beams, distant whispers of wind slipping beneath doorways. Each sound resonated inside her chest, filling her thoughts with half-formed images, echoes of memory or imagination she couldn't quite place. And always there was the mirror, waiting at the end of the hall, patient, inescapable. She found herself once again in front of it, compelled by something within her, a tugging curiosity or dread, maybe both intertwined so tightly she couldn't separate them. She stood, still, breathing carefully. Her reflection emerged reluctantly, shaded by the dim hallway lights. Clara stared into the murky glass, transfixed by the quiet strangeness that stared back. Her hair lay damp and limp from exertion, eyes shadowed by fatigue, features made foreign by distortion. Clara leaned closer, peering into the glass, examining the subtle imperfections, the faint scratches, tiny fractures that webbed at the corners, suggesting the mirror had endured more than she knew. Her heart rate quickened subtly, a flutter beneath her ribs, as the glass seemed to ripple again slightly, just beneath the surface, like water disturbed gently by an unseen finger. She pressed fingertips against the cold surface, tracing its imperfections slowly. The mirror was icy, unpleasant, as though it actively repelled her touch. Clara drew back her hand, glancing down at her fingers, as if expecting some stain, some remnant from the glass. But there was nothing visible, only the lingering sensation of unease. She turned away abruptly, heading toward the bedroom at the end of the hall, walking briskly, pretending not to hear the faint, whispering hum emanating from behind her. Night deepened further, enveloping the cottage in complete darkness, and Clara lay in bed, eyes wide open, listening, every nerve raw and exposed. She felt the cottage around her, breathing softly, steadily, a rhythmic pulse beneath her fingertips. Sleep eluded her, slipping just beyond reach, each attempt met by fragments of unsettled dreams and distorted images, faces shifting in shadow, whispering figures seen through cracked glass, whispers that mimicked her own voice but spoke words she never uttered. Restless, Clara rose again, pulled gently by the discomforting quiet toward the hallway, guided by instinct rather than reason. The floor creaked beneath her bare feet, cold seeping into her skin as she moved, almost soundlessly, toward the waiting mirror. She paused, her breath shallow, heart pounding, quietly, unevenly, as though she stood at some invisible threshold, unable to move forward or retreat. Slowly, she lifted her gaze once more into the reflection. It stared back impassively, familiar, yet alien. She moved her hand slowly, watching carefully this time. The reflection mirrored her motion, but not quite precisely. A lag again, subtle yet unmistakable, like an echo rather than a mirror image. Clara felt her pulse quicken into a pounding, dizzying thrum. She swallowed, voice barely a whisper. "What are you?" For a long moment, the reflection was perfectly still. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, its lips moved into a subtle smile, a smile Clara had never formed. She jerked back sharply, heart stuttering painfully in her chest, blood suddenly cold. Her breath came in shallow, frantic gasps as she stared, wide-eyed, terrified, frozen to the spot. The reflection stared back, unmoving now, expression blank again, as if the smile had never existed, as if it had never moved at all. Yet Clara felt the truth of it deep inside her bones, undeniable, irrevocable. Behind her, somewhere in the darkness, the faint sound of laughter, a hollow, chilling echo, drifted softly through the cottage. Clara stood rigid, trapped between reality and fear, unable to tear her gaze away, knowing instinctively, terribly, that the reflection was watching, waiting for her to move first. Chapter 2. Echoes. Sleep became something Clara chased but never quite caught, always slipping away at the moment she began drifting toward it, leaving behind fragments of restless dreams that dissolved before she could fully grasp them. Nights stretched themselves thin, endless, with darkness pressing hard against the cottage windows, whispering secrets just beyond clarity. Clara lay awake, eyes wide and dry, staring into shadows that trembled at the edges, listening intently to the quiet creaks and murmurs of the old cottage, searching for meaning in every sound. Sometimes, as she hovered, between wakefulness and sleep, she heard whispers, low, rhythmic words, not quite audible but unmistakably human. They seemed to come from inside the walls, soft echoes hidden behind peeling wallpaper and splintering wood. At first, she dismissed them as the trickery of exhaustion, the frayed edges of her imagination stretched too thin. But soon the murmurs took on shape and depth, unintelligible yet insistent, rustling in her mind like dried leaves disturbed by an unseen breeze. In the mornings, Clara felt fractured, her body brittle and heavy, skin too tight. Days blurred into one another, becoming indistinct passages of pale sunlight and unsettling silence. The cottage, she realized slowly, seemed to breathe around her, a subtle expanding and contracting, as though it lived quietly beneath her notice. Her presence felt like an intrusion, a disruption of its natural state, and yet she couldn't imagine leaving now. Something held her here, compelled her to remain, even as dread slowly burrowed deeper beneath her skin. One afternoon, driven by restless energy, Clara began exploring the rooms again, searching perhaps for distraction or answers, or both. In the sitting room, dust motes danced gently in pale sunlight that leaked through grimy windows. She paced the floor, listening to her footsteps, measured and deliberate, echo softly against aged boards. Her foot pressed on a particular plank, eliciting a faint but hollow groan beneath her weight. She paused, heart quickening. Something about that hollow sound felt intentional, deliberate, as though the cottage itself were trying to draw her attention downward. Slowly, cautiously, she knelt, running her fingers over the roughened surface. The wood was brittle, splintering slightly beneath her fingertips, cool to the touch, a texture both rough and strangely inviting. She pressed firmly, and the board shifted, a barely audible click, as it lifted slightly at one edge, revealing a small, darkened cavity. Beneath, Clara's breath caught. With trembling fingers, she pried it upward, revealing a shadowed recess below. Within lay a bundle of folded papers, tied neatly together with faded red string. They looked aged, but not old enough to belong to some distant past. Rather, they felt familiar, almost recent. Carefully, she reached into the darkness and lifted the bundle out, feeling an odd chill pass through her as she held it in her hands. Sitting cross-legged on the floor, Clara untied the string. The thin fibers frayed beneath her fingertips. The paper crackled gently as she unfolded the first letter, yellowed edges trembling slightly in her unsteady hands. Her heart beat heavily, unevenly, as she began reading. The handwriting was immediately, disturbingly familiar. A looping script she recognized instantly as her own, though she had no memory of ever writing these words. She felt a tightening in her chest, a quiet panic rising like cold water creeping up from beneath. The letter described events Clara hadn't experienced yet, meticulously detailed, written with unsettling clarity. It spoke of sleepless nights, whispers in the walls, and fear steadily building beneath a carefully maintained facade of calm. The words she read felt invasive, too accurate, and worse, they knew her intimately. Her pulse quickened painfully, throat tightening with dread. Clara turned quickly to the next letter, then another, each revealing more details, events unfolding exactly as she was, experiencing now. But then the letters began speaking of moments yet unseen, yet to be lived. Each page grew progressively darker, foreboding, as though each word itself carried a quiet warning. She felt nauseated, disoriented, trapped in a cycle she didn't yet fully understand. The final page was shorter, containing only a single line, written hastily, desperately. "The mirror sees before you do." Her hands shook violently, the paper slipping through numb fingers onto the floor. Clara sat, frozen, breath shallow, eyes wide in horror. She glanced instinctively toward the hallway, toward the darkness beyond where she knew the mirror waited patiently, silently. It took minutes, maybe hours, to gather the courage to stand again. The letters lay scattered around her feet, their words now tattooed upon her memory, irrevocable. She moved like someone underwater, movements thick and sluggish, each step toward the hallway a conscious effort, resisting her body's instinct to flee. The hallway was dim, shadows bleeding slowly outward from corners and crevices. Clara approached the mirror hesitantly, each step echoing softly in her ears. She stopped a few feet from it, staring, afraid to move any closer. Her reflection looked back impassively, a figure slightly blurred, framed by tarnished silver and darkened wood. Yet, as she looked carefully, something caught her eye, a smudge or stain on the glass. Clara leaned in slightly, her pulse roaring like a wave inside her head. It wasn't just dust or grime, she realized with horror. They were fingerprints, not hers, but someone else's, pressed from inside the glass itself. The shock stole her breath, squeezing her lungs until breathing felt painful. Clara's reflection shifted subtly, as though restless, impatient, waiting for something. She stared into its eyes, wide and terrified, seeing her own fear reflected and distorted back at her. For a moment she thought she saw the reflection's expression change subtly, a flicker of satisfaction, of dark amusement. But the moment was fleeting, leaving doubt in its place. She stepped back quickly, dizzy, her throat dry, a ringing panic swelling inside her mind. The cottage creaked quietly around her, mocking her fear, whispering unintelligible truths. She turned, stumbling back to the sitting room, desperate to escape the reflection's steady gaze. Inside, she knelt again, gathering up the scattered letters with trembling fingers, clutching them desperately as if they held answers she needed but feared. She placed them back into their hiding place beneath the floor, pressing the board carefully into place. Her fingers lingered briefly, feeling its cool, rough surface, wondering how long the letters had waited there, waiting for her arrival, waiting to reveal their truths. Clara stood shakily, her head throbbing, body heavy. The cottage seemed smaller, tighter now, the walls pressing closer, squeezing gently. Every room felt crowded, filled with unseen presences. Whispers floated gently, almost imperceptibly around her, words still beyond her grasp. She knew then that sleep would evade her again tonight, that dreams, whatever dreams might come, would carry only darker messages, darker warnings. Turning slowly, reluctantly, she glanced toward the hallway again, the mirror still visible from her angle, its surface dimmed by shadows. Even from this distance, the fingerprints stood out clearly, stark and undeniable, pressed from somewhere beyond, hidden, unreachable. The reflection within waited patiently, calmly, quietly. As Clara watched helplessly, heart pounding violently, the fingerprints began to fade, slowly, carefully erased by unseen hands within the glass itself. She felt a scream building painfully in her throat, but no sound emerged, only silence, heavy and suffocating, filling the cottage, sealing her within it. The letters, she realized in horror, had told her everything and nothing at all, promising something worse yet to come. The whispers began again, louder now, clearer. And this time, she thought, terrified, she might finally understand what they were saying. Chapter 3. Doppelgänger. The village was small, a faint smudge of civilization against the dense forest, barely noticeable from the narrow road that threaded quietly among thick trees and whispering leaves. Clara drove slowly, carefully, aware of each gentle bump beneath the car's wheels, each shift of gravel as if marking her distance from the cottage, counting, moments rather than miles. She hadn't intended to leave, but the cottage had grown restless in her presence, walls shifting imperceptibly, rooms changing shape in subtle ways she couldn't yet fully acknowledge. She needed fresh air, a break from the constant watching, the feeling of eyes on her from mirrors, windows, and shadowed corners. Pulling the car into a small parking space near the village's only cafe, she stepped out hesitantly, boots crunching softly on the damp earth. The cafe itself looked weathered but friendly, wooden signs faded by sunlight, flower boxes empty and cracked. Inside, a bell jingled softly as she entered, announcing her presence to a room filled with gentle murmurs of conversation and the smell of fresh coffee mixed faintly with old wood and smoke. At first, no one seemed to notice her arrival. Clara approached the counter slowly, absorbing the scene. Mismatched chairs around scratched tables, faded photographs lining the walls, a persistent sense of timelessness, as though she'd walked into a memory rather than a place. A woman appeared from the kitchen, smiling gently until her eyes settled on Clara. Her smile faltered subtly, a quick shift of expression, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. "Hello," Clara began tentatively, her voice thin and uncertain. I know who you are," the woman interrupted, soft but firm. She was older, her face deeply lined, hair silver and tightly pinned. Her gaze fixed steadily on Clara, cautious, unreadable. "You're staying in Margaret's cottage." The way she spoke her aunt's name, Margaret, hung heavy in the air, a shadow slipping quietly between them. Clara shifted uneasily. "Yes, I am," she replied slowly, noticing how the conversations around her had quieted, leaving whispers suspended mid-breath. She felt eyes carefully avoiding her gaze, yet intensely aware of her presence. The woman nodded carefully, watching her. "Strange," she murmured finally, "you being here. After everything." "After everything," Clara echoed, an unease twisting tightly inside her chest. The woman hesitated, words visibly forming, then falling away unsaid. "Best not dwell on old things," she replied, a forced neutrality returning to her voice. She glanced away, turning to prepare a cup of coffee. "There's no comfort to be found in ghosts." Clara wanted desperately to press her for answers, but silence had thickened around her again, villagers returning to whispered conversations behind raised coffee mugs. The bell above the door rang softly once more, but Clara didn't turn to see who entered. She paid quietly, leaving hurriedly with more questions and fewer answers than before. Outside, the air felt colder, sharper against her skin. Clara walked unsteadily to her car, glancing around nervously, sensing eyes watching from behind curtains, behind doors barely opened. As she reached for the handle, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the car window, a sudden flash that startled her. She paused, leaning closer, heart quickening. Her reflection's eyes seemed different, sharper, clearer, gazing intently back at her, an expression darker than her own. Clara recoiled slightly, forcing herself to look away, fumbling into the driver's seat. The drive back felt shorter, more hurried, her thoughts racing alongside the darkening woods. She parked abruptly outside the cottage, a vague panic pushing her inside, anxious to shut the door against the world. Inside, the rooms felt wrong, subtly shifted. Furniture seemed displaced slightly, chairs turned at unnatural angles, books stacked differently, objects rearranged without her knowledge or memory. Clara walked slowly, carefully through rooms, heart fluttering anxiously in her chest. Her fingers brushed across tables and shelves, attempting to confirm what her eyes couldn't fully believe. She couldn't trust her own memory now, didn't trust her own eyes to tell the truth. Sleep continued to elude her that night, and Clara lay awake, listening intently. The whispers returned, closer, clearer now, yet still incomprehensible, language just beyond reach. She felt the cottage breathing around her, deeper breaths now, longer pauses. She wondered if it was waiting, anticipating something. When she rose in the dark, Clara moved through rooms silently, guided more by habit than vision. In the hallway, the antique mirror waited patiently, its presence now oppressive, impossible to ignore. She approached slowly, knowing she must face it, though fear had tangled around her heart, holding it tightly. Her reflection emerged reluctantly, blurry at first, but quickly sharpening. Clara stared intently, searching desperately for signs that it was still her own face gazing back. The reflection met her gaze steadily, but its expression began shifting slowly, eyes darkening subtly, lips parted slightly as if to speak. Her breath caught painfully. Then it moved, slowly, deliberately, independently from Clara's own frozen body. The reflection's lips formed silent words, eyes wide, expression urgent, terrified. Clara leaned closer, pulse racing, trying desperately to decipher the silent warnings. "What?" she whispered, heart pounding. "Tell me." But the reflection continued silently, mouthing words Clara couldn't quite grasp, frustration growing as the seconds stretched painfully. Panic edged into her vision, a sense of desperation clawing at her chest. "What are you trying to tell me?" Clara pleaded louder, voice trembling. With anxiety, her reflection stopped abruptly, eyes widening as though startled, terrified of something unseen. Before Clara could react, the reflection jerked backward suddenly, violently, vanishing completely from the mirror, leaving only empty darkness where her face had just been. Clara screamed, recoiling sharply, stumbling backward against the wall, heart exploding in panicked, dizzying beats. The mirror now showed only empty space, darkness stretching endlessly behind the glass, as though the reflection had never existed. She stared into the emptiness, breath rapid, vision blurring, tears forming uncontrollably in her eyes. She reached forward hesitantly, fingers trembling as they touched the cold surface of the mirror. It was solid, lifeless, offering no answers, no reassurance, only emptiness reflecting her deepest fears. Her throat tightened painfully, and she turned away quickly, chest constricting in terror. The cottage now felt entirely foreign, unknown, unwelcoming. Something had shifted irreversibly, leaving her trapped in confusion and dread, unable to trust even her own reflection. She fled to the bedroom, closing the door behind her, breathing rapidly, panic trembling in every nerve. But even behind closed doors, she felt watched, surrounded by unseen eyes, whispers returning louder now, clearer. Words just beginning to break through the veil between dreams and reality. Exhaustion pressed heavily on her, finally pulling her towards sleep, unwanted yet unavoidable. As consciousness slipped away, she heard the whispers finally form into a clear, single phrase. "She was here before you." Clara's eyes snapped open again, heart racing violently. A shadow stood briefly in the doorway, framed by the faint moonlight slipping beneath the door. It vanished instantly, leaving behind only echoes of footsteps receding quickly down the hall. She sat upright, rigid, frozen in fear, knowing now that she was no longer alone, that someone, something had returned to reclaim what was once theirs. Chapter 4. Fractures. The days stopped making sense. Time folded in upon itself, hours tangled with minutes, becoming indistinct, untrustworthy. Clara had retreated deeper into the cottage, sealing herself away from the outside world. Windows remained closed, blinds drawn tight, cutting off even the most fragile thread of sunlight. The world outside felt foreign, distant, a place she could no longer access, a place that no longer belonged to her. She moved slowly through the cottage, increasingly uncertain of where she ended and the house began. Every room seemed unfamiliar, slightly altered each time she entered. Furniture shifted subtly overnight, repositioned as if by unseen hands, as though the walls themselves conspired quietly against her. Her belongings, once comforting, now appeared sinister. Objects she couldn't remember acquiring, photographs she no longer recognized. Everything was shifting beneath her feet, reality tilting, imperceptibly toward madness. Clara had begun avoiding all reflections, covering mirrors and reflective surfaces with heavy blankets, desperate to eliminate any trace of the other Clara. The version that stared back with knowing eyes, lips moving in silent warnings she couldn't decipher. Still, she felt watched. Invisible eyes tracked her movements, whispers lingering just behind her, always just beyond her reach. Sleep was no longer restful, but filled with dark visions that bled into waking, moments until she couldn't tell one from the other. One morning, or perhaps it was evening, the distinction now meaningless, Clara sat at the kitchen table, hands trembling slightly as she poured lukewarm tea into a chipped porcelain cup. She stared at the liquid, rippling gently, wondering vaguely about the bruises that now marked her wrists, deep purple and raw. She had no memory of how they got there, no recollection of pain or struggle, only a vague sense of discomfort, an unease she carried beneath her skin. She raised the cup carefully to her lips, eyes unfocused, staring blankly at the faded wallpaper peeling gently from the wall. Her vision blurred slightly, eyes heavy with exhaustion, yet sleep felt too dangerous, too uncertain. Each moment of unconsciousness brought new, violent dreams, visions of another version of herself, trapped somewhere else, screaming silently, desperate to communicate something crucial. The cottage whispered gently around her, words forming clearly, yet dissolving before reaching her ears. Clara set the cup down sharply, a thin crack forming along its porcelain surface. She stood abruptly, moving toward the hallway instinctively, drawn by an invisible cord tugging her steadily forward. In the hall, the mirror stood covered by a thick blanket, a shadowed, bulky shape pressing outward. Clara stopped a few feet away, pulse quickening, breath shallow. Her heart beat a slow, irregular rhythm, anxiety creeping up her throat. She reached forward, hesitantly, fingers trembling as they grasped the blanket's edge, pulling it back carefully, revealing the mirror beneath. It appeared ordinary now, silent, cold, reflecting only her tired, bruised face. Clara stared hard, searching for any slight movement, any sign of her reflection's independence. She saw nothing but her own haunted eyes staring back, hollow and distant. Yet the sense of being watched intensified, prickling sharply at the back of her neck. Clara stepped closer, breathing unevenly, eyes scanning the mirror's tarnished edges. Her fingers traced the carved wooden frame gently, noticing small, subtle cracks spiderwebbing across its intricate patterns. She pressed gently, curiously, and felt a shift, a slight movement beneath her fingertips. The frame was loose, hiding something behind it. Her heart pounded harder, pulse roaring in her ears. Carefully, urgently, she pried at the frame, fingers clawing desperately. A faint cracking sound, then a section gave way, completely falling to the ground with a quiet thud. Behind the broken frame, tucked neatly into the space behind the glass, was a small photograph, yellowed with age, edges brittle but clearly preserved with deliberate care. Clara's breath hitched painfully as she lifted it, feeling an icy dread seep through her veins. The photograph was of a woman, identical to herself in every detail: hair, eyes, the gentle curve of her face. But her expression was pure terror, eyes wide with fear, her mouth obscured by a large, unknown hand gripping tightly across her lips. Clara's vision blurred, a wave of nausea twisting painfully in her stomach. She dropped the photograph, stumbling backward, suddenly dizzy, her mind spinning violently with questions, fears, images that shifted and dissolved before she could fully grasp them. She leaned heavily against the wall, gasping for air, feeling the cottage pressing closer, walls tightening, squeezing. She raised shaking fingers to her face, realizing now that tears streamed uncontrollably down her cheeks. The whispers intensified, clearer now, echoing softly through rooms, repeating the same phrase over and over, urgent, insistent. "She tried to warn you." Clara slid down the wall, body trembling, heart aching with panic. Her eyes flicked wildly around the hallway, shadows deepening, stretching toward her, fingers of darkness reaching gently, insistently. She pulled her knees to her chest, rocking slowly, breathing shallowly, fighting to stay present, to remain anchored in reality. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time no longer mattered. Clara felt numb now, body heavy, unable to move. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her once again, pulling her into dreams she couldn't escape. In sleep, she wandered rooms endlessly, mirrors lining every wall, each reflection a slightly different version of herself. Eyes accusing, mouth screaming silently, desperately trying to communicate truths she still couldn't understand. She woke, suddenly, violently, heart pounding painfully against her ribs. Her body ached deeply, skin raw, scratched in places she hadn't realized. Bruises had spread, darkening along her arms, thighs, ribs, evidence of violence she couldn't recall. Panic surged through her veins, filling her chest, stealing her breath. She stumbled again to the mirror, now uncovered, waiting patiently, knowing she would return. Her reflection was there, watching her silently. Yet this time it moved independently, lifting, its hand slowly, deliberately, fingers pressing against the glass from within, leaving marks, smudges, prints of someone trapped desperately behind the surface. Clara pressed her own fingers against the cold glass, matching them to her reflection's prints. They aligned perfectly, yet she felt nothing but icy, lifeless glass beneath her touch. Her reflection stared at her, eyes dark, mouth moving silently again, forming words that finally became clear. Simple, terrifying, inevitable. "Let me out," Clara screamed, stumbling backward, knocking into furniture, heart racing, panic twisting painfully inside her. The mirror's surface rippled slightly, as though something pressed against it from behind, something desperate, angry, intent on escape. She turned, fleeing blindly through the cottage, colliding with walls, bruising herself further, gasping for air. She reached the front door, pulling desperately, only to find it jammed, immovable, as though sealed by unseen forces. Panic swelled, uncontrollably, her mind screaming with terror, confusion, desperation. She spun around again, eyes wide, breath ragged, sensing the mirror's presence even from here, feeling it reaching out invisibly, tendrils of dread wrapping tightly around her body, pulling her back. Then, clearly, from somewhere deep within the cottage, a door creaked open, slowly, deliberately. A quiet, undeniable invitation into the unknown. Chapter 5. Shadows Inside. Clara spent hours, days maybe, stripping the cottage of every reflective surface she could find. Mirrors, polished picture frames, metallic pots, anything capable of reflecting her pale, anxious face had to go. She covered windows with heavy curtains and blankets, shrouding rooms in perpetual dusk. The cottage sank deeper into shadow, the silence thickening around her, pressing against her skin like a damp cloth. She carried the mirrors outside one by one, piling them in the tangled grass behind the cottage. Her hands trembled as she stacked them, avoiding glimpses of her reflection, turning her head sharply whenever it flickered in her peripheral vision. Even outdoors, beneath the oppressive gray sky, the mirrors seemed alive, breathing quietly beneath their coverings, whispering softly among themselves. Yet it wasn't enough. In the dim confines of the cottage, Clara still caught fleeting images of herself, distorted, twisted versions reflected in the blackness of a coffee cup, in the small puddle of water pooling around a leaking faucet, in the polished brass handle of the door she had tried desperately, futilely, to escape through. Each distorted reflection watched her, waiting patiently, its eyes dark and knowing, its presence insistent, relentless. Sleep remained elusive, a thing remembered but never fully experienced. Nights became blurred passages of half-dreams, filled with whispering voices and shadowy figures. Clara often woke drenched in sweat, breath coming in rapid, painful gasps. The cottage walls seemed closer each, morning, pressing inward, making the air thin and sharp. One morning, or perhaps late evening, time had lost all meaning. Clara stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing her trembling hands in water so cold it burned. She stared into the chipped porcelain basin, avoiding the window directly in front of her, covered hastily with thick fabric. Still, her gaze drifted upward, compelled by instinct or dread, drawn by an irresistible pull. She froze, heart racing. The window's covering had slipped slightly, leaving a narrow sliver exposed. Through this thin gap she saw her reflection, a shadowed face, her own, yet subtly wrong. Its eyes stared back at her, dark and unwavering. Clara tried to look away, tried to turn her head, but her body remained stubbornly still, trapped in the reflection's gaze. Then, slowly, terribly, the reflection's lips parted. The voice that emerged was brittle, edged with a sound like splintering glass, sharp and fragile. "There's no escape from what's coming," it whispered. Clara recoiled violently, stumbling backward, crashing against the kitchen table. Cups shattered on the wooden floor, shards scattering around her feet, glinting dangerously. Her pulse surged painfully, breath shallow and panicked. She clutched the table edge, knuckles white, steadying herself. But the whisper lingered, echoing softly, unmistakably in the silence. She couldn't bear it anymore. The mirrors, especially the antique ones still concealed beneath blankets in the hallway, had to be destroyed completely, obliterated from existence. With desperate determination, Clara moved toward the hallway, heart hammering erratically, fear twisting sharply inside her chest. The antique mirror stood shrouded, an imposing figure waiting silently at the end of the hall. Clara approached slowly, each step careful and deliberate, her breathing quickening with each footfall. Her fingers reached hesitantly toward the blanket, pulling it back sharply. The mirror emerged, darkly reflective, silent, waiting. Her reflection was there instantly, clearer than before, eyes wide, expression twisted with terror or triumph. Clara couldn't tell any more. Its mouth moved again, speaking with the same brittle, scraping voice. "You can't stop it. You never could." "No," Clara whispered back, her voice shaking, barely audible. "You're not real." The reflection smiled coldly, mockingly. "Then neither are you." With a sudden scream, Clara grabbed a nearby wooden chair and swung it violently toward the mirror. The impact sent sharp vibrations through her bones, glass shattering explosively, raining shards onto the floor. She swung again, wildly, fueled by terror and rage. until only an empty wooden frame remained, splintered and broken. Breathing raggedly, she stared at the destruction, heart racing painfully. But relief didn't come. Instead, from behind the shattered mirror, something dark and viscous seeped slowly outward, a black, oily substance that oozed through cracks, spreading quickly along the wall. The smell was immediate and overwhelming, a sickly combination of mildew and decay. Clara stepped back, horror paralyzing her limbs as the black mold expanded rapidly, crawling like a living thing, spreading hungrily across walls and ceilings. It consumed everything it touched, staining surfaces irreversibly, swallowing the cottage in shadow. Her throat tightened painfully, vision blurring as panic surged again, stronger this time, uncontrollable. She stumbled backward, crashing into the opposite wall, eyes wide with disbelief and fear. The mold moved closer, fingers of blackness stretching toward her, eager, insatiable. Clara fled blindly, tripping through rooms, colliding with furniture, knocking aside belongings in her frantic escape. Yet every room was the same. The mold was everywhere, spreading aggressively, turning familiar spaces into something alien and monstrous. She reached the front door, pulling desperately at the handle, but it remained locked, unyielding, trapping her inside. Behind her, the mold crept steadily closer, whispering softly now, unintelligible words forming beneath the steady pulse of her heartbeat. She turned again, fleeing toward the back of the cottage, searching desperately for escape, but every exit was blocked, windows sealed shut, doors locked inexplicably from outside. The mold now consumed entire rooms, reducing them to shadowed, indistinct shapes, erasing her presence, her past. In a last, desperate move, Clara ran upstairs, heart pounding violently, pulse roaring in her ears. She burst into the small attic room at the end of the corridor, slamming the door shut behind her, pressing her body against it, breathing rapidly, unevenly. For a moment, everything went still. Silence thickened, oppressive, heavy with anticipation. Slowly, carefully, Clara turned to face the attic space. Shadows crowded corners, hiding objects she couldn't clearly identify. Yet one thing stood out, illuminated faintly by moonlight filtering through cracks in the walls, a large canvas covered by a dusty sheet. Compelled by dread or inevitability, Clara approached slowly, fingertips brushing the rough fabric gently, hesitantly. She pulled the sheet away sharply, revealing a painting, a portrait. It was her own face staring back, perfectly rendered, eyes wide, filled with an expression of profound horror, a silent scream frozen eternally. Yet, the more Clara stared, the more she saw subtle differences. A scar she didn't recognize, hair slightly altered, lips parted as if trying to speak a final warning. Beneath the painting, scratched into the frame in jagged, frantic letters, were the words, "It's already inside." Clara's vision blurred, knees weakening as terror seized her completely. She heard the attic door creak softly behind her, felt coldness creeping closer. She turned slowly, heart frozen in her chest. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted by darkness, stood a figure identical to herself. Features, perfectly mirrored yet subtly wrong, distorted by shadows. It stepped slowly toward her, movements jerky, unnatural, a grim smile spreading slowly across its lips. "It's time," it whispered gently, its voice cracking like fragile glass, splintering within her mind. Clara pressed backward against the wall, trapped, watching helplessly as the figure reached slowly outward, fingers elongated, distorted, shadowy tendrils stretching eagerly toward her. "You were always the shadow," it murmured, softly, smiling gently as darkness closed around them both. Clara's body froze, heart hammering painfully, vision narrowing to a single shadowed doorway, now open, waiting patiently. She stood trembling, breath shallow, knowing with terrible certainty she had no choice but to face whatever waited within. From beyond the doorway, a voice whispered softly, chillingly familiar, gently mocking her fear. "Welcome back." Chapter 6. Buried Memories. The library sat at the far edge of the village, square, a squat building of brick and shadow that seemed to shrink deeper into itself, embarrassed perhaps by the knowledge it guarded. Clara had driven there quickly, without fully remembering how she'd left the cottage or navigated the tangled roads beneath a sky drained of color. Her knuckles were pale against the steering wheel, fingernails digging into its worn leather surface. Her thoughts were tangled, knotted by sleeplessness, woven through with a desperate hope that somewhere, hidden, within these walls, answers waited patiently. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and mildew, quiet murmurs of history whispering from the corners. Clara moved slowly down narrow aisles, fingertips brushing across spines of faded books, her touch hesitant as if fearing the secrets inside might bite. A small room at the back, labeled simply Archives, waited silently, door slightly ajar, beckoning her forward with quiet insistence. She stepped inside cautiously. The room was cramped and windowless, illuminated by a single dim bulb that flickered gently, sending shadows dancing nervously across the walls. Boxes and folders filled shelves from floor to ceiling, arranged with vague indifference. Her heart quickened, pulse fluttering nervously beneath her skin as she reached for the nearest box marked Local History. Clara's hands trembled as she lifted a thick, yellowed newspaper from the stack, its headline faded but legible. "Search continues for missing woman." Below the words was a grainy photograph. Clara's breath caught sharply. The woman's face, framed by dark hair, was unsettlingly familiar. Eyes wide and uncertain, lips pressed thinly. She turned another page and found another photograph. Different woman, same face. Again and again, the same eyes, the same uncertain smile, staring at her from dozens of headlines spanning decades. Each article described disappearances, young women who'd walked out into the woods or vanished from locked rooms, without explanation, leaving nothing but silence behind. Her vision blurred, the room shifting beneath her feet. Clara steadied herself, pressing a hand against the rough shelf. The weight of familiarity settled heavily over her, thickening in her chest. She forced herself to continue, fingers shaking as they rifled through documents, news clippings, faded photographs. Each face felt like an accusation, an echo, reflecting back some fragment of herself she couldn't clearly define. Hidden beneath the pile of newspapers was a small, worn diary, leather cracked and faded, pages brittle with age. Clara lifted it carefully, its weight heavy in her palm. Her Aunt Margaret's handwriting sprawled across its pages, looping and uneven, growing more frantic toward the diary's end. Clara read carefully, heart thudding painfully with each line. "I tried to stop it, but the mirror demands its price," Margaret had written. "The women are sacrifices, necessary, inevitable. It began long before me and will continue after. But each face taken is one step closer to escape." Clara's throat tightened, breath shallow as she continued reading, dread seeping steadily into her veins. Margaret's final entry was brief, hurriedly scrawled. "It wants Clara next." It always wanted Clara. The diary slipped through numb fingers, falling softly to the floor. Her vision tunneled, panic swelling sharply in her chest. Clara pressed a trembling hand to her forehead, breath coming in shallow gasps, suddenly, unsure of anything. Her memories, her identity. She felt as if her entire existence had been hollowed out, replaced with shadows and reflections she no longer recognized. She stumbled out of the archives, clutching the photographs and diary to her chest, rushing toward the exit, desperate to escape the suffocating air inside. Outside, cold rain had begun to fall, thin needles of water piercing her skin, soaking quickly through clothing and hair. Clara barely felt it, the numbness spreading. Through her limbs, thoughts fracturing. The drive back felt endless, roads blurred by rain and confusion, trees crowding closer, branches clawing hungrily toward her car windows. She parked unevenly, leaving the vehicle running, door ajar, as she stepped out into the wet, bitter evening. The cottage loomed ahead, dark and silent, windows blackened, a structure that had grown alien, hostile. Clara's feet dragged heavily up the porch steps, dread growing steadily with each movement. Her body, screaming to turn back, flee, disappear into the night. Yet something stronger compelled her forward, a twisted sense of inevitability, a terrible curiosity that wouldn't release her. Inside, shadows stretched lazily across the floor, rooms filled with dense, oppressive silence. She walked slowly through the darkness, each step heavier than the last. The cottage was changed again, subtly shifted, shapes distorted, unfamiliar objects rearranged. Clara felt trapped within a stranger's dream, one she couldn't awaken from. She reached the hallway instinctively, moving toward the empty wall where the mirror once hung. The shattered remains had vanished. Now, only blank wood stared back. Yet Clara felt its gaze as keenly as before, pressing heavily against her skin. A noise caught her attention, a low scraping sound from the bedroom upstairs. She froze, pulse racing violently. Then slowly, compelled by dread or madness, she climbed the stairs, movements quiet, controlled, breathing shallowly, trying to contain the panic rising within her. The bedroom door stood open, darkness spilling out like ink. Clara approached cautiously, peering inside. The room appeared empty at first glance, bed neatly made, curtains drawn tight. But then movement caught her eye, a shadow slipping across the room, barely visible, disappearing through a doorway she couldn't recall existing before. Her heart stuttered, yet she followed, pulse hammering violently. The doorway led into a narrow, shadowy hallway, lined with unfamiliar portraits whose faces were obscured by darkness. Clara moved slowly, feet sinking slightly into thick carpeting that muffled her footsteps, making her presence feel ghost-like, unreal. At the hallway's end stood another mirror, larger, framed heavily in dark, ornate wood. Clara approached cautiously, breathing unsteady, eyes wide with fear and expectation. Her reflection appeared instantly, clearer than ever, vibrant in the shadows, watching her carefully, expression solemn, yet knowing. As Clara watched, transfixed, her reflection's expression shifted subtly, eyes growing colder, mouth twisting slowly into a dark smile. Before Clara could react, the reflection moved, stepping aside suddenly, revealing behind it a long, shadowy corridor she hadn't noticed before. Through the mirror, Clara saw clearly what lay beyond. Her reflection was dragging a lifeless body down the corridor, face turned toward her, eyes fixed with a cold, triumphant glare. Clara's vision blurred, horror stealing her breath, body shaking violently as she recognized the face of the corpse. It was her own. "No," she gasped, voice ragged with disbelief. The reflection paused, smiling mockingly, fingers digging deeply into the lifeless Clara's wrists. Then it dragged the body further into darkness, disappearing completely. The mirror rippled softly, sealing shut, reflecting again only Clara's terrified, living face. But behind her, reflection's wide eyes, something dark stirred. An emptiness, a hunger that felt achingly familiar. From deep within the mirror, a whisper emerged, her own voice distorted yet perfectly recognizable. "Now you understand." Clara stumbled backward, throat tightening painfully, panic clawing upward, yet there was nowhere left to run. The corridor around her had vanished, leaving only an endless darkness pressing closer, pulling her slowly, inevitably, toward the waiting mirror. Chapter 7. The Other Side. Clara stopped counting the days, stopped trying to separate nights from the restless fog of daylight. Sleep now brought only vivid horrors, an endless carousel of fractured scenes she couldn't escape. Dreams spilled into reality, leaving her stranded in unfamiliar rooms, her body contorted awkwardly on cold floors, her skin clammy with sweat and something darker, something viscous and staining she couldn't quite identify. The cottage itself had begun to twist, subtly reshaping its own bones. Walls moved overnight, creating new hallways lined with mirrors. Hundreds of mirrors, all facing inward, reflecting endless echoes of herself. Clara felt their presence, their silent accusations, even when her eyes were closed. Mirrors whispered to her, taunted her, muttered distorted words she couldn't clearly decipher but felt deeply in her bones. She woke now in a narrow corridor she didn't recognize, sprawled across a threadbare rug stained with dark patches that seeped outward like ink. Her hands shook violently as she lifted them into view, fingertips stained black, wrists bruised, flesh raw from injuries she didn't remember inflicting. Her breath caught sharply, panic rising thickly into her throat. Standing shakily, she stumbled down the corridor, her reflection trailing alongside in each mirror she passed, expression cold, accusing. Clara avoided looking directly into their glass surfaces, fearing what might stare back, fearing those eyes darkened by shadows and something cruelly familiar. Yet, despite herself, her eyes drifted toward the mirrors again, compelled by a dark curiosity. Hundreds of identical faces stared back, each slightly altered, each whispering silently, lips moving frantically. She leaned closer, breath fogging the glass, struggling to interpret their silent, frantic speech. "You did this," one reflection whispered softly, accusingly. Another joined in, voice louder, clearer, edged with brittle glass. "You're the one who let it out." "No," Clara whispered desperately, shaking her head, covering her ears, though the voices persisted, echoing louder now from all around. She turned away, stumbling blindly through rooms, each filled with endless reflections, disorienting, impossible. Clara's reflection shifted subtly each time, expressions moving from anger to sorrow, to fear, flickering rapidly like slides projected too quickly to understand. She reached out desperately, hands pressing against the walls, trying to steady herself, trying to silence the voices. Her fingers brushed something, slick, cold, and she recoiled sharply, turning her palm toward her face. Blood coated her skin, dark and thick. Clara's vision blurred, nausea twisting violently in her stomach. She staggered backward, heart racing painfully, breath shallow and rapid. In the mirror beside her, the reflection smiled darkly, knowingly. "You can't escape yourself," it murmured mockingly. Clara screamed, a raw, desperate sound that shattered the silence, shattering mirrors along the hallway, glass exploding outward in glittering fragments. She shielded her face, feeling sharp pinpricks of pain as tiny shards sliced her skin, embedding themselves gently beneath. The cottage trembled, walls shifting visibly, groaning softly, reshaping themselves again. Clara lowered her bleeding hands slowly, eyes wide with horror as the mirrors rearranged, reforming in fractured patterns, their reflections twisted, warped grotesquely. She watched helplessly as the largest mirror cracked loudly, splitting from top to bottom, revealing a gaping darkness beyond its surface. Her reflection stood just behind the broken glass, clear and vivid, a cruel smile curving its lips. Then, deliberately, impossibly, it stepped forward, pushing through the shattered glass as if passing through water. Clara backed away, body trembling uncontrollably, breath frozen in her throat. The reflection's movements were jerky, unnatural, limbs bending at odd angles, joints cracking softly. Its eyes never left Clara's, dark and mocking, filled. with contempt and something like hunger. Its feet landed soundlessly on the splintered floor, fragments of glass crunching beneath its weight. What are you? Clara stammered weakly, voice thin and fragile. The reflection tilted its head slightly, observing her curiously, a cruel amusement flickering across its features. I'm you, it replied softly, voice distorted like scratched vinyl, warped yet familiar. Or rather, I'm what you left behind. Clara shook her head, tears streaming freely, down her cheeks. No, she whispered desperately, this isn't real. You aren't real. Oh, but I am, it said coldly, stepping closer, movements stilted yet deliberate. As real as the blood on your hands. Clara glanced down instinctively, seeing now clearly the dark stains spreading rapidly up her wrists, blood thickening, drying, clinging persistently to her skin. She looked up again, vision blurred, body numb with dread. What did I do? She whispered, voice breaking. I don't remember. Her reflection smiled coldly, almost pityingly. You did what you've always done, it said gently. You tried to forget, but you can't outrun memories. Clara stumbled backward, pulse roaring violently, chest tightening painfully. The reflection advanced slowly, footsteps uneven, joints twisting audibly, approaching inexorably. Mirrors lining the walls showed thousands of identical reflections stepping forward, each movement synchronized yet fractured, reality splitting open, revealing darkness behind every reflection. You locked me away, the reflection whispered accusingly, voice trembling slightly. But now it's your turn. Clara felt the wall behind her, cold, solid, no escape. Her breathing grew ragged, panic seizing her completely, paralyzing her limbs, trapping her between nightmare and waking horror. She closed her eyes tightly, whispering desperately, "This isn't happening. Please, please, wake up." When she opened her eyes again, the reflection stood mere inches from her face, eyes black, mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. Its fingers reached forward slowly, gently pressing against Clara's chest, icy cold seeping instantly through clothing, through skin, reaching deep inside her ribs. Clara gasped sharply, pain erupting violently within her, body convulsing. The reflection leaned in, its breath cold and metallic against her ear, whispering softly, intimately. "Welcome to the other side." She tried to scream, but sound dissolved instantly into silence. The cottage, walls folded inward, collapsing softly into darkness, reality dissolving swiftly, leaving only echoes of her own distorted laughter, distant yet unmistakably her own. Then silence. When Clara opened her eyes again, she stood alone, staring out from within the mirror. The cottage stretched before her, eerily silent, familiar yet subtly changed. The hallway was empty, waiting patiently, walls covered again with mirrors, each surface reflecting her newly distorted image. Eyes wide, lips parted, slightly in perpetual disbelief. Across from her, on the other side of the glass, stood her reflection, her former self, smiling gently, mockingly, victorious. It whispered softly, her own voice mirrored back to her, distorted yet perfectly clear. "Now it's your turn." Chapter 8. Confrontation. Reality collapsed into itself, folding like origami into patterns Clara couldn't follow. The cottage had become a labyrinth, hallways that stretched into impossible angles, doorways opening to nowhere. Every turn brought her back to where she'd begun, confronting mirrors that lined walls she didn't remember placing there, reflections waiting patiently, silently mocking her attempts to escape. Clara moved desperately through twisting corridors, panic pulsing through her veins. Her breathing echoed harshly, amplified by silence that pressed in from every direction. The walls whispered softly, syllables indecipherable yet heavy with accusation. She felt them beneath her fingertips, their surfaces, cold and damp, shifting subtly as she touched them, warping to accommodate secrets she had long refused to face. Suddenly, a flicker of motion caught her eye. Clara spun around sharply, heart racing painfully. Her reflection stood watching from a mirror that spanned floor to ceiling, eyes dark, lips curled faintly in amusement. It stepped forward slowly, movements confident, predatory. "You're not real," Clara whispered, voice breaking under strain. The reflection smiled knowingly, tilting its head gently. "And you are?" Clara shook her head, a sharp, desperate denial, but her limbs felt numb, rooted in place. "You're just a nightmare, a hallucination." Her reflection laughed softly, voice brittle, like glass fracturing. "The nightmare is yours, Clara. You've always known that." Memories surged suddenly, violently, overwhelming her. Fragments she had locked away, images she had buried deep beneath layers of denial. Her vision blurred as scenes resurfaced. Dark woods, her trembling hands, gripping a shovel, earth freshly disturbed beneath moonlight, the metallic scent of blood sharp in the air. "No," Clara gasped, shaking her head violently. "That wasn't me." But the images continued relentlessly, vivid, undeniable. A woman pleading, her face twisted in fear, eyes wide. The woman from photographs, from headlines. The woman Clara had denied knowing, though recognition throbbed painfully in her chest. She saw herself reflected in dark windows, digging furiously, dirt staining her, hands, breath rapid, eyes vacant. "You're lying," Clara whispered desperately, pressing palms against her temples, struggling to force the images away. "I could never—" The reflection moved closer, leaning gently forward until its face hovered inches from hers, separated only by glass. "Oh, but you did," it whispered intimately, voice a gentle hiss. "We did." Clara recoiled sharply, stumbling backward, heart hammering painfully. Her vision spun, the floor pitching beneath her feet. She turned, blindly, fleeing down another corridor that stretched impossibly long, mirrors multiplying infinitely around her, each containing an identical reflection, smiling cruelly, whispering softly. The cottage groaned quietly, reshaping itself once more, walls sliding smoothly, doors appearing and disappearing. Clara felt dizzy, disoriented, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't awaken from. Her reflection's laughter echoed softly behind her, always just beyond sight, a constant, insistent presence. She reached a doorway, pushing it open desperately, stepping into a room she had never seen before, dark and empty, except for a single chair positioned in the center. The air felt heavier here, thick and oppressive, carrying the scent of mildew and decay. From shadows opposite her, the reflection emerged calmly, stepping through solid walls as though passing through vapor. Clara froze, breath shallow, muscles tightening painfully. "I know who you are," Clara whispered, voice trembling. "You're trying to confuse me." The reflection smiled patiently, shaking its head slowly. "You know exactly who I am. You always have." "No," Clara whispered, feeling tears slip uncontrollably down her cheeks. "I'm not you." "You're right," the reflection said, voice gentle yet mocking. "You're just the shadow I cast." Suddenly, the walls around them blurred, melting into darkness, replaced by visions so vivid Clara felt them physically. A sharp pain shooting through her chest, fingers tightening around. Someone's throat, eyes wide with terror, staring up at her. Her own hands squeezing tighter, breath ragged, pulse racing with exhilaration, horror mingling indistinguishably. The scene shifted again, burying a body beneath twisted roots, earth swallowing her secrets eagerly. Clara felt dirt beneath her fingernails, felt the chill of sweat cooling on her skin, the quiet satisfaction and sickening shame mixing violently within her chest. It's not true, Clara choked, sobbing uncontrollably. I don't remember. I can't. Her reflection stepped closer, movements gentle, careful yet predatory. It placed a hand softly on Clara's shoulder, icy cold seeping instantly through clothing and skin, chilling her to the bone. You remember, it whispered softly. You always remembered. You just couldn't face yourself. Clara's body shook violently, breath coming in shallow gasps, heart pounding erratically. She felt reality fraying at its edges, memories flooding uncontrollably, truths she had, hidden even from herself, finally surfacing, undeniable, horrifying. Who am I? She whispered, voice thin, fragile. Her reflection smiled gently, eyes dark with cruel understanding. You were always the face in the mirror, you just pretended otherwise. Clara recoiled sharply, vision blurring, legs weakening beneath her. She fell onto the chair, collapsing heavily, body numb, mind spinning wildly. Her reflection knelt slowly in front of her, fingertips brushing Clara's cheek gently, almost tenderly. "Let me take over," it whispered softly. "It's easier this way." Clara's breath caught sharply, terror swelling uncontrollably, paralyzing her completely. "No," she choked weakly, shaking her head desperately. But the reflection's gaze held her firmly, compassionless yet oddly comforting. "You've carried this too long. Let me finish it." Behind them, mirrors expanded silently, infinitely, reflections multiplying, stretching endlessly into darkness. Clara saw herself repeated thousands of times, each reflection subtly altered, yet all bearing the same haunted eyes, the same resigned despair. She felt consciousness slipping, darkness pooling gently at the edges of her vision, the room dissolving slowly around her. Her reflection leaned closer, voice gentle, coaxing. "Sleep now. I'll take care of everything." Clara tried desperately to fight, to scream, to escape, but her body felt heavy, unresponsive, the chair beneath her solidifying, trapping her firmly in place. Her eyelids fluttered, consciousness thinning dangerously, breath slowing. "No," she whispered faintly, voice barely audible. "Please." Her reflection smiled softly, leaning closer, voice a gentle whisper brushing softly against her ear. "You were always me." The mirrors surrounding them fractured suddenly, violently, shards cascading gently toward the floor in slow motion, catching dim reflected light, glittering beautifully in their descent. Clara's vision darkened completely, heart slowing, consciousness slipping finally, irrevocably away. As darkness swallowed her completely, her reflection's voice lingered softly, mockingly, echoing into silence. "Welcome home." Chapter 9. Reckoning. When Clara opened her eyes, there was only glass. The world around her shimmered unnaturally, the air thick and weightless, saturated with silence so complete it pressed against her skin like a second layer. She moved instinctively, but her body felt sluggish, heavy, each gesture rippling oddly. Against a transparent barrier inches from her face, she was standing, or floating, inside a vast empty space. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, all glass, endless, seamless, reflecting back thousands of images of herself, distorted slightly at the edges like a series of ripples bleeding outward from the center. Every time she moved, hundreds of Claras moved with her, each echoing her panic with subtle variations, one smiling faintly, one weeping, one staring blankly ahead. Clara's throat tightened painfully. She pressed her palms against the cool surface in front of her, feeling the solidity of it, the cold, unforgiving resistance. She pushed harder, but the glass did not budge. Her reflection stared back with wide, frightened eyes, breath fogging the surface in uneven bursts. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a hallucination. It was a prison. Panic surged violently through her chest, raw and immediate. She slammed her fists against the barrier, but there was no sound, no satisfying crack or shudder. Only the weightless silence swallowing her effort, as if even sound itself had abandoned her here. Then, beyond the glass, movement. Clara froze, breath caught painfully in her throat. She watched, heart hammering wildly, as the world on the other side came into focus. A living, breathing world where sunlight filtered through dusty windows and footsteps echoed faintly against worn wooden floors. The imposter was there. Her double. Her thief. Clara watched helplessly as the other, her moved through the cottage with casual ease, adjusting things just so, straightening a picture frame, tossing a worn sweater over a chair. Everything done with the same unconscious gestures Clara herself had once made, now corrupted by a terrible wrongness she could feel radiating even through the glass. She screamed, a soundless, desperate thing that reverberated uselessly within her prison. The imposter left the cottage, walking briskly toward the village. Clara was dragged helplessly behind her, as if tethered to her double's shadow, doomed to witness without influence. She drifted along, trapped in her pane of invisible glass, a prisoner in a silent coffin. The villagers greeted the imposter warmly, smiles, nods, a familiar pat on the shoulder from the cafe owner, a casual wave from the grocer she barely remembered meeting. Clara pounded harder against the glass, mouthing frantic warnings that no one could see, much less hear. The imposter laughed at something the cafe owner said. Clara could see the slight crinkle around the eyes, the small, practiced tilt of the head she knew so well. She wore Clara's skin with perfect ease, no hesitation, no fear, as if she had always belonged here, and Clara herself was the intruder, the aberration. The scene shifted seamlessly again, darkness falling, the imposter sitting comfortably by the fireplace inside the cottage, sipping tea, leafing through one of the old diaries Clara had uncovered. The firelight cast flickering, shadows across her face, emphasizing the subtle cruelty now written into the features Clara once thought were hers alone. Clara's hands burned from pounding against the glass, yet she didn't stop. Couldn't. The imposter seemed to feel her rage, her presence. The smile tightened slightly, the eyes glancing sideways toward the nearest mirror. The imposter rose slowly, moving toward it. Clara felt a deep, visceral dread settle into her chest. Closer, closer. The imposter approached the mirror, steps deliberate, almost ceremonial. Clara watched, helpless, as her double leaned in toward the glass, until their faces were inches apart. For a breathless moment, Clara thought, hoped, maybe she could reach out, break through, reclaim her life. Instead, the imposter smiled, cold and triumphant. Slowly, exaggeratedly, she mouthed the words Clara had feared more than anything. "Welcome home." The words echoed through Clara's mind, a terrible finality sealing her fate. Something cracked sharply. Clara flinched violently, heart lurching. She glanced down. Tiny fractures had begun to spiderweb outward from where her fists had pounded the glass, fine, shimmering cracks catching the dull light. The imposter didn't seem surprised. She stepped back casually, watching with detached amusement as the cracks widened, splintering across the surface with a sound like distant thunder rumbling through a hollow mountain. Clara's prison shuddered around her. The reflections shifted, twisting, grotesquely, her countless selves writhing in anguish, their mouths stretched into silent screams. The cracks spread rapidly now, racing upward, outward. Light bled through the fractures, strange and cold, illuminating Clara's bruised hands, her trembling body. The imposter stood perfectly still, smiling calmly, as if waiting for something, or someone. Clara understood then, with a clarity that stabbed deep into her gut. The prison wasn't simply meant to contain her. It was meant to remake her, to reshape her into something else entirely, to strip her away until all that remained was a reflection, a hollow thing, obedient, docile. The glass shivered under one final, unbearable pressure. For a breathless moment, Clara thought she might collapse inward, consumed by the void. And then, the glass exploded. Light and darkness merged violently, swallowing everything. Clara fell forward through the shattered frame of her prison, tumbling headfirst into the cold, silent world beyond. When she looked up, she found herself standing once again in the cottage, alone. The fire had burned down to embers, casting weak orange light that barely pushed back the surrounding gloom. Mirrors still lined the walls, but they no longer showed clear reflections. Each surface was smeared, warped, wrong, an endless parade of distortions and broken selves. In the nearest mirror, a figure stirred. Not the imposter, not exactly. It was Clara, but older, wearier, her face lined with grief and something darker. She raised one hand slowly, her fingers curling into a beckoning gesture. Behind her, deeper within the mirror's depths, others gathered. Hundreds of Claras, thousands, a multitude of selves stretching back through time, each bearing the same haunted expression, the same impossible memory, waiting, calling her forward. Outside the cottage, the wind rose, howling low and mournful through the trees. Inside, Clara took an unsteady step closer to the mirror, heart hammering against her ribs, blood roaring in her ears. She knew instinctively, terribly, that she was not stepping toward escape. She was stepping into something much older, something that had been waiting for her since long before she arrived at this cottage, long before the first reflection had smiled back at the first Clara and whispered, "You were always mine." As she reached out, fingertips brushing the rippling surface of the mirror, the world tilted violently, and the mirror pulled her in, into the darkness, into herself, into what had been waiting all along. Chapter 10. Inversion. At first there was only silence, not the silence of an empty room, nor the soft, waiting hush of the dead hours before dawn. This silence was deeper. It wrapped around Clara like a thick, wet cloth, pressing against her skin, forcing itself into her lungs. It was an absence so profound it felt almost alive, a thing that watched her, breathed with her, waited patiently for her to crumble. She floated, or perhaps stood. It was impossible to tell, in a space that pulsed and shimmered like liquid glass. The air was viscous, heavy, clinging to her movements, slowing them until even breathing became an act of defiance. The walls stretched out infinitely in every direction, shifting constantly, folding and unfolding, as if the entire world was breathing in slow, suffocating rhythm. Her reflection was everywhere, in the walls, in the floor, in the sky, if there was still such a thing. Thousands, millions of Claras surrounded. Her, each trapped in their own rippling pane of glass. Some stared blankly ahead, others wept silently, clawing at the transparent walls, leaving behind smears of condensation that faded as quickly as they appeared. A few pounded their fists rhythmically, soundlessly, until blood spattered across the glass like delicate wilting roses. Clara tried not to look too long at them. She feared what she might see in their eyes, or worse, what they might see in hers. Her mind unraveled slowly, quietly. Memories she thought were immutable began to dissolve, as if submerged too long underwater. Names slipped away first, her aunt's face blurring into a smudge of light and shadow. Then places, the cottage, the village square, the narrow library with its yellowed newspapers, all melting into nothingness. Soon, even the certainty of herself began to falter. Was she Clara? Had she ever been? Or had she always been only this? A reflection, waiting for someone else's eyes to recognize her? Clara didn't know how long she had been here. Time was meaningless. Hours, days, years, they all slid past like fish beneath ice, quick and unreachable. At some point, driven by a wild, desperate instinct, she began to write. Using the condensation that formed briefly on the pulsing walls, she traced words with trembling fingers. Warnings, messages, desperate fragments of memory that she hoped, prayed, anyone would one day read. Don't trust the mirror. It's not you. It's never been you. Each message, evaporated moments after it was written, swallowed by the breathing glass. But Clara continued nonetheless, compelled by something more powerful than fear, more enduring than despair. Sometimes she thought she heard voices, soft murmurs drifting through the reflections, like echoes from another world. They spoke in tongues she almost understood, familiar yet just beyond comprehension. At other times, she swore she felt hands brush against her skin, gentle, seeking, as if some unseen force was groping blindly through the reflections, trying to find her. She was fading. She knew it. Parts of her mind, memories, fears, hopes, slipped away quietly in the endless glass maze, leaving her emptier with each passing moment. Her hands, once solid and strong, now looked translucent, flickering faintly with each movement. Still, she waited. She watched. She remembered the impostor's cold smile, the final words whispered across broken glass. You were always mine. She would not surrender. Not entirely. Not yet. And then, finally, something shifted. The glass trembled faintly, a ripple passing through the infinite reflections. The walls pulsed faster, more urgently, vibrating beneath Clara's feet. She turned, breath catching painfully, heart lurching in her chest. There, beyond the glass, a new face appeared. A girl, young, no older than Clara had been when she first arrived at the cottage, stood staring curiously into the mirror. Her features were blurred slightly by distance and poor lighting, but Clara could see enough. Wide eyes filled with wonder, cautious hands reaching tentatively toward the surface. The girl's breath fogged the glass gently, leaving brief, heart-shaped smudges. Clara rushed forward, pressing her palms desperately against the shimmering barrier. She opened her mouth to scream, to warn, but no sound emerged. Only her own frantic reflection stared back, mouth gaping silently like a fish suffocating on airless land. She banged her fists against the glass, harder, harder, leaving smears of condensation and blood. The girl flinched slightly but did not look away. She seemed entranced, her gaze fixed on Clara's trembling form. Clara's mind raced. She began writing again, faster this time, fingers tracing desperate words against the breathing wall. Run! Leave now! It's not safe. The girl's head tilted slightly, as if she had caught a whisper on the wind, but couldn't quite make out the words. Her fingers brushed the glass lightly, hesitantly. Clara felt the shift immediately. The surface of the mirror grew thinner, softer, yielding slightly under the girl's touch. The liquid glass rippled outward, distorting Clara's reflection, warping it into monstrous shapes. She could feel the space between them narrowing, collapsing. If the girl pressed harder, if she made the wrong move, Clara knew instinctively, the cycle would begin again. She didn't know what would happen to herself if the girl crossed over. Perhaps she would be trapped here forever, dissolved into the endless reflections, another forgotten face clawing helplessly at unseen walls. Or perhaps something worse awaited. The girl smiled shyly, placing her palm flat against the glass. Clara pressed her own hand against it from the other side, their palms nearly touching, separated only by the thinnest membrane of liquid glass. She stared into the girl's eyes, willing her to understand, to pull away, to run. Instead, the girl leaned closer, curiosity outweighing caution. Cracks, began to spiderweb across the glass, thin and delicate at first, then thicker, deeper, spreading outward in jagged branches. Light poured through the fractures, cold, sharp, blinding. The reflections around Clara shimmered violently, warping into grotesque parodies of herself, mouths wide in silent laughter. The girl's reflection merged with Clara's for a brief, horrifying moment. And in that instant, Clara understood. She wasn't escaping. She wasn't warning. She was inviting. The mirror pulled. With a shudder that rattled through the infinite hallways of her prison, Clara felt herself yanked forward, through the thinning barrier, toward the girl's world, toward freedom, or something that only resembled it. Behind her, in the endless corridors of glass, the other Claras watched silently, their mouths forming a single unmistakable word: welcome. And as Clara's hand burst through the glass, as the girl gasped and stumbled backward, it was already too late to undo what had begun. Too late for either of them. The last thing Clara heard, before everything inverted, before the world twisted inside out, was the sound of shattering glass, infinite and final, then darkness and breath, and a smile that wasn't hers stretching across her new face.